An Introduction to the Minnesota State Building Code. Why do we have a state building code? What are the reasons for having a statewide building code that regulates construction throughout Minnesota? The answer to that question at its most basic level is, it's required by the law. But that doesn't seem very helpful, so let's dig a little deeper into this question to understand it better. In 1971, the Minnesota State Legislature adopted Minnesota Statute 16.83, which stated, "It is necessary that building codes be adopted and enforced to protect the health, safety, welfare, comfort, and security of the residents of this state." The current Minnesota statute adopting the building code is 326B, which states in part, "The Commissioner shall administer and amend a state code of building construction which will provide basic and uniform performance standards, establish reasonable safeguards for health." This includes things like restrooms and bathrooms for basic hygiene and sanitary living, and the disinfection and pressure testing of new water services to help ensure waterborne illnesses aren't introduced into new water services and buildings that could make occupants ill or worse. The Minnesota State Building Code also establishes reasonable safeguards for safety. The building code establishes minimum structural design provisions to address minimum roof snow load limits to help ensure the roofs of buildings support the loads most typically encountered in this region, to protect the building itself and the people inside from potential collapse or other damage. This requirement for reasonable safeguards for safety also includes, among other things, components like automatic fire sprinkler systems, fire resistance rated construction separating various hazards within a building or on a site, and safety glazing to protect people from glass in potentially hazardous locations. Another component of the Minnesota State Building Code is to provide reasonable safeguards for the welfare of the people of the state. Welfare can be a rather broad category, but in the case of the building code, it addresses items like the Minnesota Accessibility Code that provides features and amenities that are necessary or helpful for individuals who may have a variety of conditions necessitating some level of access, from needing a wheelchair for mobility to needing Braille on building signage, to just needing an extra grab bar in certain locations to aid in mobility. Welfare also includes the broad provision of peace of mind to both building owners and occupants that what is built will remain as designed and intended. This is illustrated in the extensive reinforcing steel used in the elevated balcony shown in the photo to the right, to ensure it remains in place and safe for those who will use it for years to come. The building code provides for a reasonable level of comfort in construction as well. Comfort is provided for in a variety of ways, including insulation components to protect buildings and the people that use them from extreme temperatures, from harsh weather, from noise from adjacent apartments, and by providing accessible routes and safe travel paths throughout buildings and sites, to name a few examples. Providing reasonable safeguards for security is also a component of the Minnesota State Building Code. We see security provisions in things like guardrails, door locking mechanisms, and site security features like the gating system shown in the photo to the right. All of these components of and reasons for the building code are intended to benefit the residents of this state and provide for the use of modern methods, devices, materials, and techniques which will in part tend to lower construction costs. Its intent is to permit the construction of buildings at the least possible cost, consistent with recognized standards of health and safety. While it may not seem at times to permit construction at the least possible cost, it is important to remember that it is within the parameters of meeting the requirements of the adopted health and safety standards. We have looked at what the purpose of the code is itself. Now let's look at the purpose of the building official or the building department in general. The building official is charged with administering and enforcing the Minnesota State Building Code. There are definite limits to how the building official is asked to or permitted to administer and enforce the code. The building official has the authority to provide interpretations of the code. In sections where code language is not clear and in applications where there are complicating factors, like existing construction limitations, age of a building and the extent of a proposed project, or where work being proposed isn't exactly described in an applicable section of the code. In situations such as these, the building official can provide interpretations or clarifications as long as the interpretations comply with the intent and purpose of the code. A building official's interpretations shall not waive the requirements specifically provided for in the code. Earlier we mentioned that the building official is charged with administering and enforcing the building code. What is the difference between these two terms in regards to the code? Administration is a more educational aspect of enforcing the code. Administration includes, among other things, visiting with homeowners, contractors, developers, and designers about their projects, code requirements, inspections, education, etc. Enforcement is the component that ensures the code requirements are carried out throughout the project by things like correction orders, plan review correction letters, and if ultimately necessary, legal action to ensure the reasonable safeguards required by the state building code are provided. The state of Minnesota's building code is also impacted or shaped, at least in part, by a variety of federal government requirements. One of the federal impacts on the state building code is seen in the adoption of the Minnesota Energy Codes. Minnesota is required to review and adopt a new commercial energy code when it is recommended by the U.S. Department of Energy. Minnesota is also required to review and consider adoption of new model residential energy codes when they become available. The federal government also has an impact on our state building code through the Americans with Disabilities Act. In an effort to help simplify compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act for architects and building owners, Minnesota has adopted a model accessibility code that is compatible with the ADA. The Minnesota Manufactured Housing Code is another portion of the state code that is impacted and guided by the federal government requirements. As a condition of being a state administrative authority for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for the installation of manufactured homes, Minnesota must adopt installation and dispute resolution programs compatible with federal regulations for manufactured homes. One question we've often received from project designers is, what code do you use there in Hutchinson? And really, the answer is fairly simple. One part of the requirements established in Minnesota statute is, the state building code is the standard that applies statewide for the construction, reconstruction, alteration, repair, and use of buildings and other structures of the type governed by the code. The state statute also makes clear that the state building code supersedes the building code of any municipality. And the Minnesota state statute tells us that a municipality must not, by ordinance or through development agreement, require building code provisions regulating components or systems of any structure that are different from any provision of the state building code. So the simple answer to what code do you use there in Hutchinson is the Minnesota State Building Code. Having one code that applies across the state simplifies the process for both designers and builders. As a resource to owners, contractors, designers, or anyone with an interest, the Minnesota State Building Code is available to view for free at dli.mn.gov. Although there is one state building code, Let's now take a look at what the Minnesota State Building Code consists of. The Minnesota Building Code includes administrative provisions, special provisions that are specific to Minnesota, the Commercial Building Code, elevator provisions, the Residential Building Code, a conservation code for existing buildings, the Minnesota Electrical Code, the Minnesota Energy Code, floodproofing regulations, the Minnesota Accessibility Code, the Minnesota Mechanical and Fuel Gas Code, provisions for manufactured homes, prefabricated structures, and industrialized and modular buildings, provisions for manufactured home park storm shelters, the Minnesota Plumbing Code, and Minnesota High Pressure Piping Systems Code. When the Minnesota State Building Code was originally adopted in 1972, the book in this photo represented the State Building Code at that time. Currently, the Minnesota State Building Code includes all of the model codes shown in the photo below, as amended by the state of Minnesota. In addition to the model codebooks shown in the previous photo, the Minnesota Building Code also includes references to requirements in literally hundreds of published standards from over 50 different agencies who write construction and industry-related standards, including the American Concrete Institute, the American National Standards Institute, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the National Fire Protection Association, and the Structural Building Components Association, to name a few. This is similar for the Minnesota Residential Code, the Minnesota Plumbing Code, the Minnesota Mechanical Code, and others. These codes and standards we've discussed would seem substantial enough to be an all-inclusive list of the things impacting the State Building Code, but there are other state rules and statutes that also have an impact, including Minnesota Statute 326, Minnesota Rules Chapter 1800 and 1805, which specify what type of and size of projects require the design of a Minnesota licensed professional designer, like an architect or engineer. Minnesota Rule Chapter 1800 provides exemptions for certain projects not requiring professional design and can be reviewed at revisor.mn.gov. One other important component of the Minnesota Building Code that primarily affects commercial, public, or industrial types of projects is the requirement for what is called special inspections. Special inspections are required inspections that are of a very detailed and specific nature that often require specialized training for the inspector to complete. Specialized inspections include items such as concrete compressive strength testing for footings, foundation walls, or concrete slabs, fire stopping assemblies to protect penetrations in fire resistance rated walls, spray applied fireproofing to protect typically concealed structural components, high-strength structural bolting connecting various structural members of a building, and structural welding, to list just a few of the items addressed in the special inspections provisions of the Minnesota Building Code. This presentation is intended to provide an overview of what the Minnesota Building Code is and how it is administered or enforced by the Hutchinson Building Department. If you have questions about the code or about a project you are specifically considering, please contact the Hutchinson Building Department at 320-234-4216 or by email at inspections@ci.hutchinson.mn.us, and we would be happy to help you as you prepare for your upcoming project.